Margaret never imagined that the moment she'd dreamed of her entire life would become the most terrifying day she'd ever lived. The sound of her fiancé's body hitting the marble floor of St. Michael's Cathedral still echoes in her ears. 3 months later, every time she closes her eyes. Richard Blackwood was everything any woman could want in a husband. At 52, he had built a tech empire worth over $200 million, owned properties in Manhattan, the Hamptons, and London, and despite his wealth, remained surprisingly humble and kind. He was the kind of man who remembered the names of every server at their favorite restaurant, who sent flowers to Margaret's elderly neighbor just because she mentioned Mrs. Chun was feeling lonely. When he proposed to Margaret on a crisp October evening overlooking Central Park, she felt like the luckiest woman alive. But as Margaret stood there in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, watching the paramedics work frantically over Richard's unconscious body, she realized that sometimes the things we think we want most can become our greatest nightmares. The beautiful cathedral that had witnessed countless joyful unions suddenly felt like a tomb, filled with the shocked gasps of 300 guests and the desperate whispers of medical professionals trying to save the man she loved. What haunted Margaret most wasn't the sight of Richard collapsing just as the minister asked if anyone objected to their union. It wasn't even the chaos that followed, or the way her carefully planned wedding transformed into a medical emergency. It was what Richard whispered to her as the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, his eyes barely open, his voice so weak she had to lean down to hear him. "Margaret," he breathed, his fingers gripping hers with surprising strength. "I know about the letters. I know about your first husband." Those words changed everything. How do you process the fact that the man you're about to marry, the man who just collapsed during your wedding ceremony, somehow knows the secret you've guarded for over 20 years? Margaret had never told anyone about Thomas, about what really happened during those 3 short months of marriage when she was 23, about the letters she still kept hidden in a safety deposit box across town. She thought she had buried that part of her life so deep that it could never surface again. Thomas had been her college sweetheart, the kind of passionate, impulsive love that burns bright and fast. They eloped one weekend in Vegas, caught up in the intoxicating belief that love could conquer anything. But love, Margaret learned, couldn't conquer addiction. Thomas's gambling problem, which she had dismissed as occasional bad luck, revealed itself to be a consuming obsession that drained their savings, destroyed his credit, and eventually led him to steal from his own employer to feed his habit. The letters came later, after Thomas disappeared one night, leaving only a note that said he was sorry and that he loved her too much to destroy her life along with his. For 2 years, Margaret received letters from different cities across the country: Denver, Seattle, Phoenix, Miami. In each one, Thomas begged for forgiveness, promised he was getting help, swore he would make things right. The last letter came from a hospital in New Orleans. Thomas was dying, liver failure from the alcohol that had replaced gambling as his addiction of choice. He wanted to see her one last time. Margaret never went to New Orleans. She never answered any of the letters. Instead, she filed for divorce, legally changed back to her maiden name, and moved from Chicago to New York City to start over. She buried Margaret Collins and became Margaret Davidson, successful marketing executive, independent woman, someone with no complicated past and no devastating secrets. For 23 years, she had lived as if those 3 months with Thomas had been a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that belonged to someone else entirely. But now, lying in the hospital bed where he had been for the past 3 months, Richard knew. Somehow, the man who had won her heart with his gentle persistence and genuine kindness had uncovered the one thing she never wanted anyone to discover. How had he found out? Why hadn't he confronted her before their wedding day? And what did it mean for their future, if Richard even survived? The doctors called it a massive stroke, complicated by an underlying heart condition that Richard had apparently been hiding from everyone, including Margaret. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had both been keeping secrets, both protecting the other from truths they thought were too heavy to share. Richard remained in a medically induced coma for 6 weeks while his brain swelling reduced and his heart stabilized. Margaret spent every day by his bedside, holding his hand, reading to him, and wrestling with the question of whether she should confess everything when he woke up, or wait to see what he actually knew. During those long hospital days, Margaret found herself reflecting on the choices that had shaped her adult life. She had spent over 2 decades running from her past, building walls around her heart to prevent anyone from getting close enough to discover her secret. She had dated good men and sabotaged those relationships the moment they became serious. She had convinced herself that she was protecting them, but wasn't she really protecting herself from the vulnerability of being truly known? When Richard first asked her out 18 months ago at a charity gala, Margaret's initial instinct was to decline. He was too successful, too confident, too likely to dig into her background if things got serious. But something about the way he looked at her, with genuine interest rather than calculation, made her say yes to coffee. Coffee became dinner, dinner became weekend trips, and before she knew it, Richard had become the first person in decades who made her want to be completely honest about who she was. Yet even as their relationship deepened, even as Richard spoke about wanting to spend the rest of his life with her, Margaret couldn't bring herself to tell him about Thomas. What if he saw her differently? What if he questioned her judgment, her character, her ability to make good decisions? What if he realized that the composed, successful woman he had fallen in love with was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies? The day Richard finally opened his eyes, Margaret was reading him an article about sustainable farming practices, something that had become a passion of his in recent years. She looked up to find him watching her with those familiar gray eyes, and for a moment, it felt like any other morning they had shared together. Then he spoke, his voice rough from the ventilator but unmistakably clear. "The private investigator found everything," he said quietly. "The marriage certificate from Las Vegas, the divorce papers, the letters from Thomas McKenna, all of it." Margaret felt her world tilt. Private investigator? Richard had hired someone to investigate her? The betrayal cut deeper than she expected, even as she recognized the hypocrisy of her anger. How could she be furious about his deception when she had been living one for their entire relationship? "Why?" was all she could manage to say. Richard struggled to sit up, and Margaret instinctively moved to help him, her hands gentle on his shoulders despite her inner turmoil. "6 months ago, I decided I wanted to update my will before we got married. My lawyer suggested a standard background check on you, just as a formality for someone who would be inheriting a significant portion of my estate. I told him it was unnecessary, that I trusted you completely. But he insisted it was standard practice, so I agreed." He paused, his breathing still labored from the medication and recovery. "When the report came back, I was devastated. Not because of what you had done, but because you felt you couldn't trust me with the truth. I hired a second investigator to find out more, hoping to understand why you had hidden your first marriage. That's when we found the letters." Margaret sank into the chair beside his bed, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions washing over her. Relief that he knew the truth, anger that he had investigated her, shame that she had hidden so much, and underneath it all, a growing curiosity about what he thought of what he had learned. "I read every letter Thomas sent you," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "I saw the pain he was in, the guilt he carried, the way he begged for your forgiveness even as he acknowledged he didn't deserve it. I understood why you never responded, why you needed to start over completely. But Margaret, what broke my heart was realizing that you were still running from something that happened over 20 years ago." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She was still running, still letting Thomas's addiction and abandonment dictate how she approached love and trust. She had punished every man who tried to get close to her for crimes they hadn't committed, and she had punished herself by never allowing anyone to love the complete, complicated person she actually was. "The night before our wedding," Richard said, reaching for her hand, "I was going to tell you that I knew everything. I was going to ask you to share your story with me in your own words, so we could start our marriage with complete honesty between us. But then I started having chest pains, and by the time I got to the church, I could barely stand. I kept thinking about those letters, about the pain you had carried alone for so long, and I realized I might die without ever telling you that your past doesn't scare me. Your strength does. Your ability to rebuild your life completely, to become the woman I fell in love with despite everything you had been through. That's not something to be ashamed of." That's something to celebrate. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this man. This incredible man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and broken and found something worth loving. How many times in life do we get the chance to be completely known by another person? How often do we discover that our deepest fears about ourselves are not shared by those who truly love us? I should have told you about Thomas myself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have trusted you with the truth. And I should have told you about my heart condition, Richard replied. I've known for 2 years that I had significant blockages, but I kept putting off the surgery because I didn't want to worry you. I didn't want you to think you were signing up to be a widow rather than a wife. We were both trying to protect each other from difficult truths, and we nearly lost each other because of it. The conversation that followed lasted for hours. Margaret told Richard about the guilt she had carried for not going to see Thomas before he died. About the nights she had wondered if she could have helped him overcome his addictions if she had been stronger, more patient, more loving. She told him about the dating relationships she had sabotaged and the walls she had built to protect herself from ever being that vulnerable again. Richard told her about the fear he had lived with since his heart diagnosis, about the loneliness of carrying that knowledge alone, about his desperate desire to marry her before his health declined, so she would be financially secure if something happened to him. He told her about the nights he had lain awake reading Thomas's letters, trying to understand the woman he loved well enough to help her heal from wounds she had never acknowledged. But perhaps the most revealing conversation came 2 weeks into Richard's recovery, when Margaret finally asked the question that had been haunting her since he first mentioned the letters. Did you read the last one? The one from the hospital in New Orleans? Richard nodded slowly. That's the one that made me realize how much I loved you, he said. Thomas wrote about watching you graduate from college, how proud he was even though he had forfeited the right to be there. He wrote about following your career from a distance, celebrating your promotions and achievements through newspaper articles and LinkedIn posts. He never stopped loving you, Margaret, but more importantly, he never stopped believing you deserved better than what he could give you. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. He was following my career? For over 15 years. He kept newspaper clippings of every major marketing campaign you worked on, every award you received. The investigator found them in his personal effects after he died. There were dozens of them, stored in a shoebox with your wedding photo and the divorce papers. Richard's voice grew gentler. He wrote that watching you succeed gave him more peace than any treatment program ever had. He said knowing you were thriving made all his suffering worthwhile. This revelation changed something fundamental in how Margaret viewed her first marriage. She had spent decades believing that her relationship with Thomas was a complete failure, a catastrophic mistake that proved her poor judgment in love. But what if it had been something else entirely? What if it had been a love story that ended not in betrayal, but in sacrifice? Thomas hadn't abandoned her out of selfishness. He had left to save her from his destruction. The more Margaret and Richard talked during his recovery, the more she began to understand that her ability to love Richard so completely was partly because of what she had learned from losing Thomas. She had learned that love alone wasn't enough to fix someone, that you couldn't save another person from their own demons, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. These weren't easy lessons, but they had made her a better partner to Richard. Richard, meanwhile, was learning his own difficult truths about vulnerability and control. His heart condition had forced him to confront the reality that no amount of money or success could protect him from his own mortality. He had spent his entire adult life solving problems through determination and resources, but he couldn't buy his way out of genetic heart disease or negotiate with arterial blockages. I think that's why I collapsed at the altar, he admitted to Margaret one afternoon as they sat in his hospital room watching the snow fall outside. My body finally forced me to stop running from the conversation we both needed to have. I couldn't marry you while we were both pretending to be people we weren't. Margaret reached for his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become despite everything they had been through. Who are we really, then, if we strip away all the pretending? Richard smiled, and for the first time since his collapse, it reached his eyes completely. We're two middle-aged people who've made mistakes, who've been hurt, who've learned that life is more fragile and more beautiful than we ever imagined when we were young. We're people who've discovered that the greatest courage isn't in being perfect. It's in being honest about our imperfections. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Margaret expected to see one of Richard's nurses, but instead, a woman in her 60s entered, carrying a small bouquet of daisies and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, "but I'm Linda McKenna. Thomas was my brother." Margaret felt the room spin around her. In all the years since Thomas's death, she had never imagined meeting any of his family members. She had always assumed they blamed her for not being there when he died, for not trying harder to help him overcome his addictions. Linda sat down in the visitor's chair, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I was at your wedding," she said quietly. "I've been wanting to meet you for 23 years, but I never knew how to approach you. When I saw the newspaper article about what happened at St. Michael's, I realized I couldn't wait any longer." The story Linda told over the next hour transformed Margaret's understanding of her first marriage completely. Thomas's gambling addiction hadn't started with their relationship. It had begun when he was 14, after their father died in a car accident. By the time Thomas met Margaret in college, he was already deep in debt and using increasingly desperate measures to fund his habit. "He never wanted you to know how bad it was," Linda explained. "He was convinced he could beat it on his own, that love would be enough to change him. When he finally realized it wasn't, he made the hardest decision of his life. He chose to leave rather than drag you down with him." Linda pulled a worn envelope from her purse. "This is the letter he wrote to you the night before he died. He never sent it because he said you deserved to live your life without carrying his guilt. But I think you should read it now." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. The letter was written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, though shakier than she remembered. "My dearest Margaret, I'm dying, and I'm grateful for that because it means I can finally stop running from the pain I caused you. I want you to know that leaving you was the only unselfish thing I ever did. I loved you too much to let my sickness destroy the bright, beautiful future you deserved. I know you probably think I abandoned you, but the truth is, I spent every day after I left you trying to become worthy of the love you gave me. I never succeeded, but trying to be better made the rest of my life bearable. I hope you found someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. Completely, honestly, without reservation. If you have, tell him he's the luckiest man alive. Love always, Thomas." Margaret read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Richard reached over and gently took her free hand, and Linda sat quietly, allowing her to process this final gift from her first husband. "He talked about you constantly," Linda said finally. "Even at the end, when he was barely conscious, he would ask the nurses if they thought you were happy. I told him I was sure you were, because anyone as strong and kind as you deserved happiness." After Linda left, Margaret and Richard sat in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I feel like I can breathe for the first time in 23 years. All this time I thought I had failed him. I thought if I had been a better wife, a more patient person, I could have saved him." "You couldn't have saved him," Richard said gently. "But you did something more important. You loved him enough to let him make his own choices, even when those choices hurt you. That takes a different kind of courage." 3 months later, they had a second wedding ceremony in Richard's hospital room, with just Margaret's sister, Richard's brother, and Linda McKenna as witnesses. The hospital chaplain performed the ceremony, and Margaret wore a simple blue dress she had bought in the hospital gift shop. Before they exchanged vows, Margaret read Thomas's final letter aloud, honoring the love that had shaped her even as she celebrated the love that was healing her. It was nothing like the elaborate celebration they had planned, but it was perfect in its simplicity and honesty. When the chaplain asked if anyone objected to the union, Linda stood up and said, "I know Thomas would have wanted me to say that he gives his blessing to this marriage. He always said Margaret deserved the very best love could offer." Richard's recovery was long and difficult. He underwent triple bypass surgery and spent weeks in cardiac rehabilitation. Margaret took a leave of absence from work to care for him, and during those quiet months of his recovery, they learned to be completely honest with each other about everything: their fears, their hopes, their daily struggles and small victories. It was during this period that Margaret truly began to understand the depth of Richard's character. She had fallen in love with his success, his confidence, his ability to solve any problem that arose in their lives together. But watching him struggle with the simple task of walking to the bathroom without becoming winded, seeing him cry with frustration when he couldn't remember a word or complete a sentence, she discovered something far more valuable than his wealth or achievements. She discovered his humanity, his vulnerability, his capacity to accept help without losing his dignity. Richard, in turn, saw Margaret in ways he had never imagined during their courtship. The poised marketing executive he had fallen in love with revealed herself to be someone who could find humor in the middle of crisis, who could advocate fiercely with doctors while remaining tender with her patient, who could hold space for both hope and fear without being overwhelmed by either. She wasn't just beautiful and successful. She was unshakably strong in the ways that mattered most. One evening, about 4 months after the wedding that never was, they were sitting together on Richard's couch, he with his legs elevated as his doctor had ordered, she reading emails on her laptop, when Richard suddenly spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious enough that Margaret immediately closed her laptop and gave him her full attention. "The private investigator found something else," Richard continued. "Something I didn't tell you about in the hospital because you were dealing with enough." He reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a manila envelope. "After Thomas died, he left instructions with his lawyer. If you were ever to get married again, your new husband was to receive this." Margaret stared at the envelope, her name written on it in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Below her name he had written, "For the man who will love Margaret better than I ever could." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper. It was a letter addressed to Richard, though Thomas had written it years before they had ever met. To Margaret's future husband, "You don't know me, and I pray you never have to understand the pain I caused the woman you love. But I need you to know that Margaret is the most extraordinary person you will ever meet. She has the capacity to love completely, to forgive generously, and to rebuild herself from ashes when life burns everything down around her. I destroyed the first chance I had to love her properly, but I'm counting on you to treasure what I was too broken to protect. She will try to hide her scars from you, to pretend she doesn't need anyone, to convince you that she's stronger than she is. Don't believe her. She needs to be cherished, to be seen completely, to be loved for exactly who she is, shadows and light together. If you can do that, if you can love her with the honesty I never managed, then you'll have something I can only dream of. Take care of her heart. It's more precious than she knows. Thomas McKenna." Margaret read the letter through tears, overwhelmed by this final act of love from a man she had thought had forgotten her long before he died. Richard read it over her shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them absorbing the weight of blessing from someone who had paid such a high price for his inability to love well. "He knew you before I did," Richard said quietly. "Everything he wrote about you, that's exactly who I fell in love with." A year later, Richard was back to full health, and Margaret had started a non-profit organization for women rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships. They called it Second Chances, and their first fundraising gala was held at the same hotel where they had met at that charity event 18 months earlier. The organization grew quickly, funded partly by Richard's business success but sustained by Margaret's passion and the stories of the women they helped. Margaret discovered that her own experience with rebuilding after loss gave her a unique ability to help other women navigate similar transitions. She could speak their language of fear and shame because she had lived it herself. During their second year of marriage, Margaret received a call from Linda McKenna. Thomas's sister had been following the work of Second Chances and wanted to make a donation in Thomas's memory. "I think he would be so proud of what you're doing," Linda said during their phone conversation. "Helping other women find their strength after losing their way. It's like he's still loving you through the work you're doing for others." That conversation led to an annual scholarship fund in Thomas's name for women seeking education or job training after leaving difficult relationships. Margaret spoke at the first scholarship ceremony, telling the story of her 2 marriages for the first time publicly. "I learned from my first husband that love isn't always enough to save someone," she told the audience of scholarship recipients and donors. "But I learned from my second husband that when you're honest about who you are, including your failures and fears, you create space for a love that can heal even the deepest wounds." After the ceremony, a young woman approached Margaret. She was probably in her late 20s, with the guarded expression Margaret recognized in so many of the women who came to second chances. "Mrs. Blackwood," the woman said, "my name is Sarah, and I wanted to thank you for your story. I've been hiding from my past for 5 years, convinced that if anyone knew the truth about my first marriage, they'd never want to be with me. But hearing you speak tonight made me realize that maybe my story isn't something to run from. Maybe it's something that could help someone else." Margaret felt her heart expand as she listened to Sarah. This was why she had been willing to share her most private pain publicly, not for her own healing, which was already well underway, but for the healing of other women who were still running from their own complicated truths. 6 months later, Sarah sent Margaret an invitation to her wedding. The note inside read, "You taught me that the right person doesn't need me to be perfect. They need me to be honest. Thank you for showing me the difference." They received a letter in the mail one day with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Thomas McKenna, dated 3 weeks before he died in that New Orleans hospital. It was an article about his work volunteering at a homeless shelter, helping other men overcome gambling addictions. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written in faded blue ink, "He never stopped loving you, and he never stopped trying to make amends for the pain he caused. I thought you should know. A friend." Margaret never found out who sent the clipping, but she kept it in her jewelry box next to her wedding ring. Some stories, she realized, don't end the way we expect them to. Some love survives even when the people don't. Some secrets lose their power to hurt us when we finally share them with someone who sees our scars as evidence of our strength rather than proof of our weakness. The question Margaret asks herself now, whenever she speaks to women who are hiding from their own difficult pasts, is this: what would your life look like if you stopped running from the parts of your story that feel too complicated, too messy, too human? What if the person meant to love you is waiting on the other side of your honesty? Some of us spend decades protecting others from who we really are, never realizing that the right person doesn't need our protection. They need our truth. They need our complete, complicated, beautifully imperfect selves. Because love, real love, doesn't flourish in the safety of our carefully constructed personas. It grows in the rich soil of our authentic lives, with all their shadows and light. What secrets are you carrying that might be keeping you from the love you deserve? What would happen if you trusted someone enough to let them see all of you?